Disney's Cars is without a doubt one of Disney's greatest franchises ever created. A trilogy of movies that all grossed incredibly well at the box office, merchandising sales that are in the billions of dollars, and an overall huge love from the automotive world. At the center of all the attention is the main protagonist of the series, Lightning McQueen. We're first introduced to him in the opening of the first movie, which shows that he's a cocky, full of himself guy that only cares about winning and being number one. He believes that he doesn't need anybody to succeed in both racing and life. However, through the course of the movie, McQueen learns that the real treasures in life are found when you slow down and learn how to care about others rather than yourself. His character arc in the first movie ends with him helping out the king after his horrendous accident. Even though he was on his way to winning the championship, he realized how important it was to help someone else rather than himself. Cars 1 is a very solid movie and is easily in my top 5 for best Pixar movies. Now I can't say the same for Cars 2, as that movie was not great. It completely threw out the idea of the first movie and went with a bizarre spy action thriller on how those with oil made alternative fuels look bad so that the oil prices would skyrocket. Oh yeah, and Tow Mater was the main character. I don't really want to dive into this movie in more detail, so let's focus on Cars 3 instead. Which brings everything back to the original setting, racing. McQueen is older and is now a veteran of the Piston Cup series, racing against similar veterans of the sport. This is also the first time we see McQueen win a race in the Piston Cup, but his winning ways would soon end when a newcomer would enter the sport, Jackson Storm, a rookie and a next-gen driver who was faster than all the pre-existing veterans of the sport. He would make his name by passing McQueen on the final lap at the wannabe Phoenix Raceway and win the race, which would quickly forecast what was to become of the series. As more and more next-gen drivers came into the sport and began to replace the veterans, and by the final race, McQueen was one of the few remaining veterans competing against the next-gen drivers. This race also contained this scene that was surprisingly dark for a PG-rated movie, Lightning McQueen's horrific crash. Now this would lead to McQueen basically going on a road trip to try and figure out how to beat Storm for the Florida 500, all for him to end up swapping out during the race for his trainer Cruz to give her a chance to race. And she would end up winning the race, and technically since McQueen started, he got credited with the win as well. The only issue with this ending is that McQueen never technically beat Storm by himself, but Cruz did it for him. However, I see 3 different ways that McQueen could end up beating Storm, one of which was planned as the original ending to the film, but I'll start with the least likely to occur, which is Storm getting involved in a crash. Crashes in racing are known to happen, as the high intensity of racing against other skilled drivers can cause some to make some bad mistakes. The Racing League NASCAR is one of those that have accidents occur often, as there are usually 35 plus drivers giving it everything they got to finish as high as possible. We see that crashes occur in cars, some deliberately, such as Chick Hicks's famous Dynaco's All Mine scene, where he takes out the entire field, and others occur on accident, such as the wreck at the Florida 500. Now the only problem with this is that Storm is usually in the front of the pack, where accidents are least likely to occur. Now granted, there have been times when the leader has been taken out by a slower car or an issue with the car, but those are extremely uncommon to happen. Even if a wreck were to happen involving Storm, there's still many of the faster next-gen cars that would more than likely pass McQueen. Another point worth mentioning is that if the wreck was substantial enough, then they would throw a caution out, which would stack up the field for a restart and severely hinder McQueen's chances at winning. Not to mention that McQueen more than likely has the same risk of being involved in that crash as Storm, as we've seen 2 times before when he barely scrapes by without getting any damage. Now the chance of Storm wrecking out isn't 0, but it would be extremely rare for this to occur. Now the second idea of McQueen being Storm that I can see happening is still quite a long shot to happen, but it is more possible than this, and it has to do with pit stop strategy. Now pit stops are a crucial part of racing, as drivers eventually will need their car's tires changed and their fuel tank to be refueled, which is where the pit crew comes in. These are highly skilled and quick men and women that can make or break an entire race depending on how fast and efficient their stop is. In the first movie, it ends up being McQueen that goes against his pit crew's mindset, which is to change his tires since he hadn't done so at all during the race. This ends up with both his tires popping on the last lap and him struggling to make it back to the line. Now you might be wondering how this relates to McQueen beating Storm. Well, it actually opens up 2 different possibilities for Storm to actually lose. The first of which is Storm having an issue during his pit stop. As most of you probably know, like McQueen has an extremely fast pit crew, mostly thanks to Guido. Even in Cars 3, Guido can change tires faster than Storm's crew, which is crucial if if a final pit stop has to be made within the last few laps. In theory, if the gap between McQueen and Storm was large enough and there was less than 5 laps to go, then there's a probable chance of him being able to manage the gap and push himself to keep Storm behind. One of the few issues I do see with this is once again a caution coming out and diminishing his lead to Storm. Another problem that I see is that there might also be other cars that have saved enough fuel to make it to the end of the race without having to pit. The other way McQueen could beat Storm is for him to run out of fuel in the closing laps. This has happened multiple times before when the leader runs out of gas on the final laps of the race, and thus the person in second usually goes on to win the race. In fact, earlier this year at a NASCAR race at Gateway, the leader Ryan Blaney was coming to take the white flag when he ran out of fuel and his teammate Austin Cindric, who was in second, would take the lead and go on to win the race. Something similar could happen to Storm if he wasn't careful saving fuel on a long final run to the finish. But like all the other options so far, this is another if situation. However, this final way that McQueen could defeat Storm was actually planned as the original ending for Cars 3, which is for him to utilize the draft. If you don't know what I'm talking about, let me explain. On bigger tracks such as Daytona and Talladega, NASCAR runs a special setup that is meant to keep the pack close together and allow for passing. Drivers will pull behind another driver's car, and the air from the front car will create a low pressure that acts as a slingshot for the car behind, propelling it at a faster rate of speed than the lead car. Using the draft allows for cars that are usually always in the back to contend for wins, as years prior have shown that the smaller underfunded teams can pull off incredible feats. McQueen only learned how to use the draft when training with Smokey, which he then uses in the race at the Florida 500 to pass the next-gen rookies. In the deleted scene from the movie, Sterling kicks McQueen out of Rusty's for the race to replace him with Cruz, meaning that he wouldn't be able to run the race. Tex Dynaco would approach him and offer to enter him under Team Dynaco, which he ends up accepting. We then see in a different deleted scene that on the final lap, McQueen was right behind Storm, similar to how Cruz was during the actual final cut, and he slingshots past Storm to win the race. This was the way McQueen finally beat Storm, by winning at a super speedway-esque track by utilizing the draft properly, but it was scrapped and replaced with what we have today. So there you have it. Those are the 3 main ways that McQueen could end up beating Storm legitimately, but if he really wants to cheat, then he could just use a rocket.